Hey everyone, Coops here from the whole Box and Dice Dragon Ball Super deck tech again for you today, and this one is an absolute powerhouse. We're looking at Masked Saiyan. He's the leader from the starter decks. As soon as I saw this card, I knew there was a lot of potential. We've all seen various iterations of the deck. You know, we've seen it with the blue in it, we've seen it with the red in it, we've seen it with just blue or just red. I've even seen people attempting to do things like masked veggies. There are some very, very interesting things this deck can do. I think this build, which is effectively based off one of the local builds that went undefeated in a couple of our tournaments around here, it has been heavily tweaked, heavily tested. There was different things in it, you know, during the mecha time, you know, especially because yellow was a very prevalent leader. But this has been very much refined for the current meta. The deck just hits like a truck. It has so many ways to just keep punishing your opponent. And there is like crazy turn 2 kill potential in this deck. It's often the smarter plays just to wait and simply kill them on turn 3. But the fact that the deck has the ability for such an explosive start is just absolutely sane. We'll start off with the leader, and it is obviously Masked Saiyan. You should all know by now what it does. You have the ability to mill cards. You either can pick up critical or a 5k power bonus. Obviously, with the new rules, the way that when leaders flip, you lose the critical that you pick up on the front side, but you can retain the 5k power, so you have those turns as well, where you can awaken on the back of picking up 5k on the front side, 5k on the back, plus critical. You're sitting at 25k. It is just absolutely nuts. Has the standard when you awaken, draw 2, which is very relevant for the deck, because the deck wants cards in hand. And let's jump straight into it. It's a 3-color deck. It's red, blue, black. This is, in my honest opinion, probably the most competitive deck that exists at the moment. It's fast, it doesn't have a weakness, it's consistent, the ratios are pretty even, split between black and non-black cards, and it just punishes anything other than a perfect start from your opponent. Doesn't care if you're playing aggro, doesn't care if you're playing control, has too many ways to just keep coming back at you. We'll start off with the black cards, and you've got 4 of the 10k pump. Pretty straightforward. You're running a leader that's black. You want a 10k pump. You're an aggressive deck. You want to pump those attacks to get through. Runs 2 copies of Power Aura Mirror. This card is an absolute powerhouse. Look at some other the big kind of 3-drop cards. You've got things like Oob, and you've got the whatever thing that Pan needs to go under. You know, cards that are above the generic kind of, you know, 2 for 15, 3 for X. Power Aura Mirror with 5 cards in your warp becomes a 25k beater, and that is just absolutely insane. Power, like for a 3, effectively gives you overwhelm for 3, right? And it costs nothing. So it's just no mana cost, no energy cost. And with like a Furthering Destruction Champer, this becomes a 35k double strike finisher. That's just nuts. And so Mirror, huge fan of this card. And obviously to play this card, you're putting cards into your warp, so you're always satisfying the requirement. Absolutely great card. We'd probably love to run a 3rd copy, but the reality is there's just plenty of other great stuff in the deck too. 4 copies of the Thought Patrol Trunks. Card selection is great. 15k beater. Filtering out what's on the top of your deck and adding something to your hand is always relevant. Plus we get the benefit with the Killer Sword as well. 3 copies of Unrelenting Trunks. This one has the Overwhelm return when it goes to warp back to your hand, which is awesome. Love just the replayability of this card. Also means you pick up a 5k pump defensively, which is always good. Playset of the Increasing Evil Masked Saiyan. If you saw the mirror video, you know how much of a fan I am of this card. Helps you awaken in the grindier matchups, removes key pieces from evolution chains, or even just key things on the board, like 2-drop Carbas, for example, that you just don't want your opponent to have access to. Running a playset of Killer Sword Trunks. Now, you've probably seen some kind of crazy loop play with this, where you're bringing back cards and you're looping it for, not infinite combos, but like 6 or 8 battle cards a turn. Now that we've kind of moved away from some of the earlier builds of this deck, you know, I'm sure you've seen versions with like Yajirobe and stuff in it. Now that the meta kind of doesn't have a requirement for those cards, this is just a great way to play one of our 3-drops. You can play Power Aura Mirror, you can play Kaba. There's heaps of good stuff that you can play, you know. And the fact is that you can bring back, you know, battle cards that, like, even just annoying things, like the amount of times where, like, you could play something like a Charco or a Furthering Destruction Champer, and it's a 16k. It's just that extra 1k is just already puts you on the front foot, and then just makes it that much more difficult for your opponent to deal with. But on top of that, Trunks is just a great 20k body that you can do a lot of damage with. And when you can bring back, you know, a Kaba, or even just our 1 copy of Ability Unleashed Gohan, heaps of value out of Killer Sword Trunks, and very, very appropriately costed for what the deck wants to do. Running 4 copies of Mirror from Darkness, another card that just hurts our opponent through its critical. It's just another way that we can do damage. Masked Saiyan has critical, Mirror has critical. It's great to be able to keep having just this, I guess, oppression through card, disallowing, preventing them from picking up those key life cards. Nothing better than sending 10k pumps to their drop area. Running a playset of Sensu Bean and a playset of Whisa's Coercion, as well as a playset of Jarko for our blue. Bean's obviously a great card, allows us to get a blue early, satisfies the other half of the requirement for Mask in terms of having a coloured card. Just the ability to untap a couple of energy after we play something, and then swing in, get that chance to, even after an overwhelm, refresh a bit of energy. Not to play defense, just to keep the pressure on. Obviously, you can use it defensively to help your leader get through attacks, but the deck works so quickly, you rarely are using it defensively just because of the pressure that you're putting on. Whisa's Coercion, obviously great. It's a, effectively refreshable version of itself. Keep 1 blue up to have 2 goes is just absolutely great, so always happy to run Whisa's Coercion. Jarko is just an unfair card in this deck. I think a lot of people have forgotten how annoying Jarko is. There are a lot of cards that people want to combo with at the moment, and it's great to be able to kind of take those cards out of your, I guess just out of your opponent's arsenal kind of thing, and especially when you have tapped down, your opponent thinks maybe if they push or overextend, there's a way they can get through, hit a couple of Jarkos, suddenly their attack's 40k or something, and you're easily matching that off the bat. Playset of Saiyan Carbon moving into the red. This card, everyone knows how good it is. It's just one of these cards that I think will always be relevant in the game. Helps you awaken. 15k double strike early is just nuts, and you have just heaps of utility with this card. It becomes a red card for Masked Saiyans in terms of triggering those abilities. It's just an all-around excellent card, and as you'll notice, a lot of these cards are just like commons or uncommons. The Killer Sword and the Increasing Evils, they're from the either starter or the special pack, and we've got the Mirrors from the expansion, but this is not an expensive deck. Very similar to the Mirror Cell Chain deck, this is like a $160, $170 deck, which for probably the most competitive list out there is a heck of a good deal. We run 1 copy of the ability Unleash Ultimate Gohan. This is a great card. The fact that it's a 15k, can be double strike, can draw you another card. Heaps of utility. You can definitely build this deck, I guess, with a lot of selection cards or a lot of tech cards. Like you can put the, the Explosive Spirit Kid Goku in there, and you can put things like the Goku that makes the tokens. You can run all those kind of techie cards to get the benefit off Killer Sword Trunks, but the reality is the deck doesn't need it. The deck just straight up wins with the pressure it puts on your opponent that is just 99% of the time just unanswerable. Like, it's so difficult for your opponent to come back from this deck having a really good start, and even in decks like the Cell Mirror deck, which is very oppressive, you need to have an aggro deck that can also hit back at the same rate. And the reality is, decks, the versions of these decks that runs things like Topo and stuff, it's not there. I get what people are trying to do, because I've seen so many versions of this list, and I get what people are trying to do with Topo and with Quick Rush Trunks and cards like that. It's just not the way you want to build this. Hit hard, hit fast, finish up the game before they can get any kind of consistency. The Cell Chain doesn't really hurt this deck because you're always emptying your hand in terms of putting pressure back on your opponent, and the critical denies them cards anyway, so you're rarely ever kind of outgunned. Plus, this deck can fill its hand up with cards very, very quickly as well. Running a playset of Furthering Destruction Champa, it's pretty obvious to see how this card is useful in the deck. You got a couple of critical targets. When you swing with your leader for potentially 35k critical, that is very difficult for your opponent to deal with. They tap down to, let's say, turn 3 or whatever it is. They're just trying to get something out on the board, something to just stem the bleeding or get them some extra cards in hand, and you're coming at them 35k double strike crit. They're either burning their whole hand to stop that attack, especially when the attack's like the 5 down to 3, for example, and they can't use their 10k pumps. It's very, very difficult for them to get access to this, in just terms of stopping it. And then we run the playset of the starter Gokus. You draw a card when you combo with this. It's super relevant to keep filtering through your deck. I think this card is actually way too good for the game. It's actually one of the most broken cards, I think, in the game, which a lot of people just miss. The deck's only 50 cards. You're not at a 60 card deck. which those 10 extra cards make a huge difference in terms of probability, and you already take 8 cards straight away off the top, plus the 6 you're drawing. So when you can filter through the rest of your pieces, it's not hard to dig for stuff in your deck, and once you learn the deck and when you play the deck enough, you start learning the numbers, and you know by the time that you use Kaba and then use something like the Goku or even a 10k pump, you can begin to predict pretty easily what's coming into, and you can really set up those turn 3, turn 4 kill shots just because of the knowledge you have of your deck and the fact that you see so many cards in it. That's pretty much it. Like, the deck is very straightforward. It's a very easy deck to build, obviously, like card acquisition wise. There's no crazy SCR or anything in there. Cost wise, it's definitely pretty light on the wallet. The biggest thing with this deck is actually mastering and having the patience, I guess, and the understanding of when to push. You know, like I said, there are nut draws, and I saw it a couple of weeks ago, there are nut draws where you can kill an opponent on turn 2. And, you know, I see so many players, and I love it myself. There's nothing better than shaking hands after 2 turns and seeing the guys next to you are still laying out their life, right? It's absolutely hilarious. But this deck demands a lot of discipline in terms of the lines that you want to play, because you need to know what's coming up in your deck. You need to know when to overwhelm, when to get that value, but also you get the chance to always kind of overwhelm effectively because you're always milling cards as well. So it's never hard to fill up your overwhelm or fill up your drop area so you can overwhelm. And you'll notice I don't have a side deck for this. At the moment, the meta is a little bit settled, you know, on the back of Mecha not being so much of an issue anymore. And I mentioned, you know, there were different variants of this deck that played, well, you know, like the Haru Haru, for example, and then play cards like Yajirobe, and you've seen all these other versions. But I think at the moment, there's really nothing that you need to be running in the sideboard. Not suggesting go into a tournament with no sideboard, but there's a lot of stuff that it's kind of easy to think, oh, maybe that's relevant, and you'd probably be putting in just tech cards, possibly, for Killer Sword targets at this point. You know, there's no real replacement for anything that you want in here, and even if you had, like, another Kaba, for example, let's say there was another identical Kaba in black, for example, as an overwhelm card, or even just as a black card, I don't even know if you'd be necessarily running those cards, because the deck is really streamlined to just play through its lines. You'll see everything costs 4 or less, and it just has a really simple and really clean curve to it that I just cannot stress how just difficult it is for your opponent to get back in the game when, you know, don't draw something crazy like 4 Sensor Beans and, like, I don't know, like 3 Furthering Destruction Champer, and you're just like, okay, this is far from ideal. But, like, the bad draws on this deck aren't even that bad because you filter through and you see so many cards. So if you've seen the Mirror deck, now you've seen the Mask deck. These are 2 of the most competitive decks, in my opinion, in the format at the moment. The Mask is pretty much in a league of its own. You know, I've played this against everything that's relevant at the moment. I've seen it just dismantle key decks with great win percentages. I don't think there's anything so far in Tournament of Power that's really terrifying for this deck. You know, I love the Caulifla Ginyu Force, like, that's hilarious. That actually looks like such a fun deck to play. You know, that's not going to give this trouble. The red-green veggies, how difficult is that going to be to get around? Only time will tell when we see that deck go live. We've already started testing against it, but the reality is you've got the speed to match pretty much anything I've ever seen, ever built, you know, with the exception of probably the Mecha GT deck, but that was such a narrow window and you had to draw those right cards, and then a gate at the end stopped you anyway. You know, there's been like less than 2 or 3 actually competitive and viable decks that can even run with this deck up to this point, and I don't know when the next ARG event is. Like, we're in 26 April at the moment, but I'll be shocked if you don't see a whole bunch of masks running around, just because it should be able to go unchallenged. You know, it should be able to go unchallenged. There's not a lot of stuff your opponent can bring in from the board in terms of, like, disrupting what you're trying to do. It doesn't care for the cell chain. Bloodlust doesn't necessarily hurt the deck either. Not that that's being played a whole lot. And I think it's just an excellent, you know, it's just an A1 deck. And I've included a link to Podbean. If you've been following a podcast called DBS Down Under, I do a couple of guest spots on that every now and again. The man behind that, Philipsy, this is pretty much his creation. You know, I don't want to get into this whole, like, crazy stealing deck idea thing again, because, like, that was just the most amazingly fun set of, week period where people were just having whinges about that. This is a deck that he's been working on for ever since Mask was revealed. He did a podcast on it very, very early on in the piece. He called it pretty much the day the spoilers came out that Mask was going to be a powerhouse and probably in red, blue, black. And we see it here, just an incredible list. And if you are looking for something competitive to play, you've got, under $200 to play around with. This is what I'd be looking to build, because the deck just hauls ass. Like, it kicks the shite out of other decks. So this would be my prediction for for a hyper competitive deck. If you wanted to take this to a big tournament, this is what I'd be playing, literal card for card. Come up with a sideboard, but just test it out, and you'll see how quickly it is difficult to slot things into the sideboard and how relevant they actually are, or in this case are not, to the deck construct. But huge shout out again to Philps for this one. I think this one is a killer list. I've been an absolute blast playing with it, tweaking the numbers, working on just getting it to the point that it is now. If you check out the Podbean, you'll see that it was a slightly different list about, I think it was like 6 or 8 weeks ago now, that Philps was using. He went undefeated in a tournament here. So you can see how the deck's kind of evolved, and it'll make sense. When you start playing it, you'll see the cards that were in there for Mecha, and now that that's not an issue, you can see where this deck has gone, and I guess the point that it's up to. So if you enjoyed this one, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe if you are new. Go check out Philps and DBS Down Under on Podbean, throw them a follow, and just download the podcast. You'll learn so much listening to it. We talk a lot of crap most of the time, but there are some little gems every so often that we come up with. But a super fun deck. Get behind this one. If you want to support the channel, consider checking us out on Patreon. We've got a couple of giveaways going at the moment. I'll link all of that in the description below. But thank you so much for watching this one. My name is Coops. This is the whole Box and Dice. Peace.